Hi everyone, my name is Caroline Needell, class of 2022, and today we're going to be talking about marine reptiles, and these are the animals that lived in the oceans when dinosaurs walked the earth during the Mesozoic, which was from 66 to 252 million years ago. So today we're going to go over the evolution, the form and function, and the extinction of three specimens that we have in the museum called the Phytosaur, the Mosasaur, and the Ichthyosaur. And just to set the stage a little bit, Earth's history is very long, and it's about 4.5 billion years ago. So what does about 100 million years ago really mean? Sometimes it helps me to use a metaphor of a year-long calendar. So just to kind of place the era that we're talking about, if we imagine that all of Earth's history, all 4.5 billion years, is encapsulated into 1 year, Earth would have formed January 1st. The first signs of primitive life wouldn't have appeared until about late November. The marine reptiles we're going to talk about today would have appeared in about mid-December and went extinct around Christmas time. And then the earliest human ancestors wouldn't have come on the scene until the evening hours of December 31st. So while 200 million years ago is a long time ago, maybe it's not so long in the grand scheme of things. So before we look closely at each of the fossils, I just want to give a brief overview of the evolution of marine reptiles. So as we will see in a couple of minutes, two of our specimens today are great examples of convergent evolution, which means that two species that are not evolutionarily related actually evolved similar traits as a result of having to adapt to very similar environments. And we'll see this with the Ichthyosaur, which bears resemblance to modern dolphins, and the Phytosaur, which looks a lot like modern crocodilians, such as crocodiles and alligators. And another interesting aspect of the evolution of marine reptiles is their evolutionary history. So two of the specimens today, the Mosasaur and Ichthyosaur, are what we call secondarily aquatic animals. And what this means is that these animals lived in the ocean, but their ancestors were actually land-dwelling, and those ancestors lived in the ocean. So this is very similar to modern whales, which some of you might be familiar with their evolution. Whales actually have terrestrial or land-dwelling ancestors, and as is the case with two of our specimens today. And more specifically, the Mosasaur had land-dwelling ancestors, and they were reptiles that were about 1 meter long. And these reptiles evolved into about 17 meters long marine, fully carnivorous predators, and that's what we call a mosasaur. Ichthyosaurs, like mosasaurs and modern whales, did also have land-dwelling ancestors, but we're actually unsure of the exact reptiles that they descended from, and this is an area of active research. The story of Phytosaurs is a little bit different because they didn't actually live in the ocean. They are semi-aquatic, so they lived part of the time in freshwater rivers and lakes, and the other part of the time, on the shoreline or the adjacent land areas next to these rivers and lakes. And this is what makes them very similar to modern crocodilians. So this is one of our examples of convergent evolution. And Phytosaurs and crocodiles, though existed in very different times and are not evolutionarily related, they both evolved similar traits as a result of having to adapt to a semi-aquatic predatory lifestyle. And so we are going to take a closer look at our Phytosaur fossil right now. So it can be helpful to compare the Phytosaur to a modern crocodilian when we're talking about how the Phytosaur lived in its form and function. So first, I want to mention one major difference between Phytosaurs and crocodilians, and that is where the nostrils are actually located. So on the Phytosaur, these are the nostrils, or what we call the external nares, and they're located on a little raised hump on the skull. And scientists think this is because Phytosaurs would be submerged just under the surface of the water, but because these nostrils are on a raised hump, they could still breathe. And this is a major difference between crocodilians, who have their nostrils at the ends of their snouts, so they weren't able to submerge while still breathing like Phytosaurs. Another aspect of the Phytosaur skull that paleontologists study to make predictions about how they lived was by looking at their teeth, which we can't see in this fossil here, but Phytosaurs had very sharp teeth, and from this, scientists can say that they were probably predators. and they think that narrow-snouted phytosaurs, like the one we have here, primarily fed on fish. But one fun fact is that Phytosaur actually means plant reptile, and this is because the very first Phytosaur fossils that were found, paleontologists thought they were herbivores, but then they examined the teeth and then realized that they were carnivorous. So next we are going to move on to the Ichthyosaur. And as I mentioned earlier, the Ichthyosaur is another example of convergent evolution, and as you can see, it looks very similar to a modern dolphin. So I'll just begin by pointing at the Ichthyosaur teeth, which are actually very sharp, and Ichthyosaurs were also predators. I'll point at the teeth one more time. Right here, they're very narrow and sharp. And then moving on, this large depression is actually the eye socket of the Ichthyosaur. This is a very large eye, and paleontologists think the eye sockets were so large in Ichthyosaurs because they actually had to dive fairly deep down into the ocean to find their prey, and there's not a lot of light in the deep ocean, so they had large eyes so they were able to still see small prey in low light regions. Another kind of relic that we can use to tell that Ichthyosaurs descended from land reptiles is actually in their flippers or fins. And I'm just outlining here the digit bones inside this fin. And so these bones look very similar to what a hand bone might look like for a land-dwelling animal. But as we can see, these structures are in the fins which Ichthyosaurs used to swim. So this is one example of how we know that they descended from land-dwelling creatures. And as we just follow the vertebrae of the Ichthyosaur down, we can see this kind of strange structure at the end, which is called the caudal fluke. And this was in the tail, this is the tailbone of the Ichthyosaur. It was on the lower half of the tail. And the Ichthyosaur used this bone to swim with its tail motion side to side, like modern fish or sharks, and unlike modern dolphins. So that's one major difference. Dolphins swim with this kind of undulatory motion and using their fins up and down. So, Mosasaurs were very large marine carnivorous reptiles. They could grow to reach actually the size of a bus at about 17 meters long. And the tail of a Mosasaur, which may have started around here, actually usually composed more than half of a Mosasaur's body. So what we're looking at on this fossil, this whole thing is probably less than half of the size of this Mosasaur. So Mosasaurs are very large. They also had very large flat skulls, and they had curved teeth that they used to snag their prey with, which we will look at an example of the teeth in a second. Mosasaurs they moved kind of like an eel using side-to-side motions, but they also had fins. And so we are going to look at another example of a Mosasaur. And as we can see, this specimen is not put together like the other specimens we've looked at. And so these bones, as they are shown in this fossil, were actually how they were found in the field. So paleontologists take bones from the field and they put them together into what they think the fossil might have looked like. But in this case, this preserves what the fossil looks like when it is found. I also wanted to highlight this fossil because it was collected by Frederick Loomis, who was a professor of paleontology at Amherst College. And he went out on expeditions from places like Patagonia to the American West to collect fossils and send them back to Amherst College. And actually our mammoth that we house in the museum, which was our school mascot, was collected by Loomis and some students, as was this fossil. And so what I also want to point out on this fossil is this fin bone. This looks a lot like a hand, but it was actually a Mosasaur fin, which is another great example of how we know that Mosasaurs, along with Ichthyosaurs, evolved from land-dwelling reptiles. And then the last thing I want to point out about Mosasaurs is their teeth, which we can see here. They're very large and a little bit curved, as I mentioned earlier. All right, now that we've examined these fossils a little bit more closely, I just want to discuss the extinction of marine reptiles because I think it's important to talk about how we know these animals went extinct and how they went extinct as anthropogenic extinctions are increasing while we're facing the increasing effects of climate change. So I'll start off with the Phytosaur. The Phytosaur went extinct at the end of the Triassic during a mass extinction 201 million years ago. And the way we think about mass extinctions is that usually they have a trigger, which is some climate event, and then what scientists call a kill mechanism, which is like what about the climate event made Earth uninhabitable for the species. So in the case of Phytosaurs at the end of the Triassic, this extinction's trigger was massive volcanic eruptions, which released a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere and caused ocean acidification, acidified surface waters, and really made aquatic environments uninhabitable for semi-aquatic reptiles like the Phytosaur. Moving on to the Ichthyosaur, extinction is actually a very interesting story because they did not go extinct at a mass extinction event. They went extinct about 95 million years ago, which is considerably before the Mosasaur and other similar ocean-dwelling marine reptiles. So the extinction of ichthyosaurs is actually a subject of scientific debate, but a recent paper came out, and that paper argues that there was a period of global environmental volatility characterized by global warming right before ichthyosaurs went extinct. So this volatility would have increased sea surface temperatures and also caused sea level changes, mostly sea level rise. And what this would have done is kind of interrupted the migration paths of ichthyosaurs, maybe changed food availability and breeding sites, which would combined have driven ichthyosaurs to extinction. So that's one exciting development. And the last specimen, the Mosasaurs, went extinct at probably the most famous mass extinction, which is called the Cretaceous-Paleogene mass extinction, which happened 66 million years ago. And this is the mass extinction that killed off the dinosaurs. And as I'm sure most of you are familiar with, this trigger was actually an asteroid impact. And some of the kill mechanisms associated with the asteroid impact at the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary are that all these aerosols were ejected into the air, blocking sunlight. Another consequence was global warming as a result of fires from the asteroid impact. Another one was acid rain. And the last one was toxic ground level ozone, which would have kind of poisoned the atmosphere around the Earth's surface. And so something interesting to note is that all of these mass extinction or extinction triggers are related to global warming, or one of the kill mechanisms is global warming, which is interesting to think about in the context of anthropogenic global warming. So just to conclude, marine reptiles are great examples of convergent evolution. Some of them are secondarily aquatic, which is a really interesting evolutionary history. And we can learn a lot about their lifestyles and their extinctions by looking at the fossil record and comparing them to extant or living species. Thank you.